Greetings from the Bates Motel. I hope that you are doing very, very well. Today in Cinema Appreciation, we'll be talking about the genre of horror and what the genre of horror actually means, going all the way back from their very earliest kind of ideas of horror, developing through the classical, then the revisionist, and all the way to today, the parody stages. And of course, you can see one of the classical Hollywood sets of all time that you probably know is Pscyho and the Bates Motel and the Pscyho house right here, this Victorian mansion. We saw the first preview for science fiction last time. Let's throw you out a couple. Let's throw you out this. Bride of the Gorilla. There's some ridiculous early horror films that show up. This escapist, just purely escapism.
And Tom Cromway, the dramatic story of a strange curse that brought terror to a man and frenzy to a woman in love. You do love me, don't you? That's all I need to know. Well, you're standing in my way, and Dina. We love each other. What are you going to do about it? Did you see this animal?
Yes, I've seen the animal. It walks in hind legs.
Like a man?
No, like a beast that walks like a man.
Oh, let's go back, Bonnie, please.
I'll never go back. Never.
Later on, you're going to see remnants of this that show up even in Michael Jackson's Thriller video.
Why don't you shoot? You can't miss.
This came out about the same time as Godzilla and dealt with the radioactivity that may impact the human condition. So what do you do with a woman that is 50 foot tall? We'll talk a little about this later on. So today, as I mentioned, we'll be talking about horror. But in order to talk about horror, we've got to talk about the emotions that show up with horror, and that is the idea of fear. When you have fear, you have a physiological response to fear. Your eyebrows get raised and pulled together. Your upper eyelids get raised. You have tense lower eyelids so you can concentrate. Your lips slightly strengthen. You get a little bit more kind of firm within the process so you can lock your body up and be able to move for aggressive action that takes place. Ironically, when we watch horror films, some of the same chemical neurotransmitters that get transmitted in our brain are the same as if we have small doses of cocaine or other type of drugs within our system. We actually get an endorphin rush. We get a neurotransmitter that literally makes it kind of fight or flight or fright, actually just stay in that exact place to see what you can do. And part of this is that we are being raised in a culture of what we call immersion fear. And that is that the more we watch television and television programming, the more we become fearful of the world that happens to be outside of us in many capacities. There's been many studies about this. We had the idea of fearing Ebola, just fear itself today. We fear each other. You know, the whole idea of stranger danger. We fear for our kids, fear. Excuse me, fear Russia, fear climate change, fear ISIS. I mean, yes, we should fear ISIS in some capacity because they are out to harm us. But if you actually look at the stats, as I'll show you in a moment, the odds of an American being killed by a foreign terrorist are minuscule. They're tiny compared to almost everything else. And so we are fear, you know, Pet Cemetery, children gone haywire, individuals coming back from the dead, serial killers that show up, the idea of fire and evil children that show up. And if you look at the fear chart over here and what you should actually fear about, these are the odds that you're going to die of any particular circumstance. If you get really up close and personal about this, you'll notice You know, the things we should fear. We should fear actually the terrible disease of cancer, which ends up killing 1 out of about 7 people in the world. Stroke is 1 out of every 24. Major vehicle accident, 1 out of every 34. And so we can look, and then we go back and we look, all right, being stung by a bee, 1 out of every 56,748. An earthquake, 1 out of every 117,127. Being fireworks, 1 of every 340,000. Bicycle accident, now there's something to 1 of every 4,919. So basically 0.02%. And then we look at such things, alcohol poisoning, more lightning, 1 in 79,000. And so we really are looking at very small. You are more likely to be killed in alcohol poisoning impact than you are by a serial killer or by a tourist, by you know, a tourist that happens to be or someone from another land. And so we get this idea of the media scare, which, whether you agree with the politics of Michael Moore or not, he's far left liberal. He does do a good job in Voting for Columbine, talking about the idea of emerging fear and why violence has gone down in the last 20 years, violent crime in particular.
Because if you turn on the evening news,
and yet our coverage of it has gone way up. And so there's a disconnect that shows up in the modern mentality. We're more fearful and less and more safe.
Remember the first time you heard that someone had hidden a razor blade in an apple at Halloween? Before long,
you ever check your candy? We used to check my kids' candy all the time when they went to their homes.
A lot of people say they won't give out candy treats on Halloween. It's too dangerous and they're too scared.
Well, guess what? There never was any razor blade in the apple. In fact, only 2 kids in the past 40 years have been killed by Halloween candy. And both of them were poisoned on purpose by relatives.
It was like a scene from a horror movie. This Hooksett man was mowing his lawn when a fox darted out of the woods and attacked his riding mower.
A warning about a popular weight loss supplement. What you don't know may kill you.
You ride them every day, but in an instant, an escalator can mangle you or a loved one. 7 on your side reveals why you may be riding a stairway to danger.
You might want to take some extra precautions. Keep a low profile. Don't go around dancing with a bunch of Americans in the streets. Make sure that you don't draw a lot of attention to yourself and the fact that you're American. The nation's top doctor says 1 in 5 Americans suffer some form of mental disorder. The Surgeon General, David Satcher, pleads with people to seek help now.
The media, the corporations, the politicians have all done such a good job of scaring the American public. It's come to the point where they don't need to give any reason at all.
This is why horror works so well in almost every genre today. We've become a fearful culture.
A blanket alert. It was in recognition of a general threat we received.
And so what is being asked then, in individuals such as Stephen King here? So this is Stephen King's understanding on why do people need horror films? And here's what he says, and I'm curious if you agree. The mythic horror movie, like The Sick Joke, has a dirty job to do. It deliberately appeals to all that is worse than us. It is morbidly unchained, our most base instincts let free, our nastiest fantasies realized. And it all happens, fittingly enough, in the dark. For those reasons, good liberals often shy away from horror films. For myself, I like to see the most aggressive of them. Dawn of the Dead, for instance, as lifting a trapdoor in the civilized forebrain and throwing a basket of raw meat to the hungry alligators swimming around in that subterranean river beneath. Why bother? Because it keeps them from getting out, man. It keeps them down there and me up there. It was Lennon and McCartney who said that all you need is love. And I would agree with that, as long as you keep the gators fed. So the argument here is we need horror films because we've become such a civilized civilization. It allows us to put into check our more morbid of fantasies. So we potentially might not do them in reality. We will let them go. We can kind of fantastically live through and say, wow, I'd really like to hurt that person, but I don't necessarily need to, because we live in such a moral, socialized culture, and the consequences can be catastrophic for one of these things. So do you believe that? Do you believe we need to keep the gators fed? That's what Stephen King believes why we need horror films. Now, we have horror films and serial killers from all over the United States. So this is the United States of horror, as you can see. We have different, and you could probably find your favorite state and see what we're actually known for in the horror industry.
What's scarier? A breaking news report of hundreds of zombies running wild in a distant town, or there's a zombie inside your child's bedroom? It's a different feeling, isn't it? Why is one more horrific than the other? While I was searching for the roots of cinematic horror,
Cabinet of Dr.
I looked up the
Caligari.
Cabinet
Remember
of
that,
Dr.
that
Caligari.
expressionist
It's a
artwork.
German expressionist film made in the 1920s. It is widely considered to be the first true horror movie ever made. The visuals are quite striking, and the nightmarish art direction succeeds in evoking feelings of unease by presenting a distorted reality. I wanted to compare, for my own personal curiosity, the similarities between modern horror movies and something made close to a century ago. Is there something that carries over, something universal, thematically or aesthetically? As I was reading the reviews, I found an interesting quote that summed up exactly what I was looking for. All a horror film need promise is horror, the unspeakable, the terrifying, the merciless, the lurching monstrous figure of destruction. It needs no stars, only basic production values, just the ability to promise horror. So I guess my next question is, what is this promise of horror? As a byproduct of the late 80s, whenever I would think of horror, my mind would immediately go to Jason, Chucky, and Freddy, or even the old Universal monsters. I lost several nights of sleep imagining those movie villains waiting for me in a dark, endless corridor, or peeking through a slightly open closet door, ready to rip me to shreds and swallow me whole. When I grew older, the evil monsters lost their appeal, but in its stead, torture porn became more popular. The focus was now placed on the natural visceral repulsion of the destruction of the human body. But in my adulthood, I realized this isn't horror. Horror is not a monster, or the extravagant gore it can cause. If that were true, then any movie brandishing a mindless slasher tearing out people's innards would be considered an achievement. But we know this is not the case. You see, the most effective horror movies are the ones that manage to make horror into a personal experience. Just like the scenario I gave earlier, having hundreds of zombies ravaging a distant city is indeed worrisome, but having one already in your house at arm's length of your children is immediately terrifying. In this video, we're going to take a look at 3 movies that have successfully told an effective horror story by respecting the balance of 3 key elements: the characters, the adversary, and the audience. They managed to blur the lines between metaphor and reality by removing the focus from the monster and placing it squarely on something we can all relate to, something we can all recognize: family. Home is where we should feel safe. Our parents and our family are supposed to give us unconditional love. What these movies do is grab these universal themes and turn them on their heads by slowly deteriorating them and taking away their safety. But first, it grounds the storytelling in family drama. The core of the 3 movies is wrapped around families dealing with grief. The Babadook is about a mother that secretly can't stand her own son because he reminds her of the death of her husband. In The Witch, we see a family of Puritans struggling with the abduction and death of their youngest child. In Hereditary, 2 characters pass away early in the movie, and we see the family dealing with the aftermath as it slowly turns them against each other. We get to know the characters, the geography of their home, where they sleep, their routine, their jobs, and we start caring and attaching ourselves to them, even their pets. Now, why is this important? Because we need to establish a bond before things start going wrong. Horror films are much more upsetting and frightening if you're invested in the characters. It was always just very important to me that these were people that you cared about, so that when things happen to them, it's not just spectacle, but it feels like betrayal. The emotional connection starts being used against you. As dysfunction sets in, we begin to feel unease. We become resistant to the family's erosion. Tensions rise, and the scenes become increasingly uncomfortable and upsetting to witness or be a part of. If you don't feel anything for the characters, then the movie is doing something wrong. Since the focus is on the families, the adversary is lying in wait, hiding within every frame. At first, its presence is small and almost doubtful, but as the movie progresses, the entity grows in size and begins to
You
take
can
up
see
space.
the light, the
It's in
low-key
the
light,
atmosphere the movie creates, in the ship's
largely
music,
because
in the
the
darkening
idea
of
of
a room,
sight is our
in the
primary
coldness of a
sense.
scene,
And so
in
when
the
you can't
paranoia
see
of
and
the
you're
character,
denied that,
until its
you
presence is
naturally, your
undoubtedly
other senses
palpable
heighten,
and
but you
oppressive.
get scared because
It
you don't
builds
have a
in
way
your
of
mind
organizing your thoughts
and
and
not
ideas
on the
about
screen.
the world around
In
you.
each movie, there's a specific adversary. The Babadook, an evil entity from a book. The Witch, a coven of witches in the woods following the whims of the devil hiding in plain sight as a billy goat called Black Phillip. In Hereditary, a pagan cult devoted to King Payman. At first glance, the adversary of each movie seems different, but the way they go about destroying the families is similar. It doesn't physically kill anyone because its purpose is to corrupt. They're not motivated by revenge or mindless carnage. Monsters want your blood, while the adversary wants your soul. This is about destroying them from the inside out. It infiltrates the members of the family and corrupts them to the point that they will be the ones that will do the deed themselves. What's worse, a monster killing a child, or having the mother do it, deteriorating the family without ever being seen, and making them the antagonist. The adversary grabs what's important to them, their children, family, beliefs, virtues, sanity, and makes them destroy it. The adversary is something you can try to fight, but never defeat. In the Babadook, the mother learns to live with the entity. In The Witch and Hereditary, they end up joining it. The adversary is not a simple villain. It's a concept. It's intangible. It lies in the unknown. It can't bleed, and it definitely can't lose. It can't be understood. It has no rules, no boundaries, no shape. It just is. Once you know of its presence, it becomes unescapable. The characters become pawns of the unfathomable. They either die or they end up serving it. The less we know of the adversary, the more power it retains. The audience is very important to the success of a horror movie. They can't just be waiting for the next scare. A good horror movie manages to involve them in the story. The movie should be a mystery. Just like the characters, they should be trying to figure out what's going on. Give them clues, even more than what the characters can see. Odd character reactions, offhanded remarks, or even close-ups of information that will be relevant later. Show them, but don't explain it. The audience should be actively trying to complete the puzzle. This puts them off guard. So surprise them, disorient them. That's when horror can be most effective. In The Babadook, we're left questioning the mother's sanity. Was this all a mental breakdown? Did she make the book? Was she losing her grip on reality? In The Witch, how did it all start? When were the kids bewitched? What other animals were familiars? In Hereditary, how many people were involved in the cult? When did she start being possessed? Did the family ever suffer from mental illness? Make them doubt themselves, throw them for a loop, but let them put the clues together. The puzzle pieces should lead to an answer, even if there's none given at the end. It makes the second viewing much more enjoyable. Ultimately, the sign of an effective horror movie is when it succeeds in gaining real estate in your mind. As an audience, you're involved in the movie, seeing the characters as your surrogates, dealing with inhuman events. But once the movie is over and the characters meet their end, the attachment is broken, leaving an unsettling feeling, and you exit the theater thinking you're done with the film, but it's still not done with you. You forgot you just spent the whole movie building a monster in your mind, one that doesn't go away. It grows when you lie in bed at night, with every unwanted sound and dark silhouette. You see, the most effective horror movies are the ones that intrude in your psyche and never leave.
And I think one of the fantastic things about that video and how it sets it up is two things. Number one, a great horror film does live on. In the aftermath of Pscyho, a whole group of individuals, thousands of adults, looked into the shower before taking a shower to look for a serial killer. Now, it begs the question, number one, what are you going to do if you find a serial killer in there or a murderer? Because at least you were hitting it had a chance before. But we run into the issue in the aftermath of watching Poltergeist, where there's a doll underneath the bed. A lot of people check under the bed to make sure there wasn't a serial killer that shows up there. My daughter loves horror films, and the first thing we do when we go into a hotel when she's traveling with me on a business trip, she looks to make sure there's no one else in that hotel spookily, so she knows at night we're safe and kind of confined, just the two of us in our own room. And yet, as this film says, the true horror would be the idea of me or her getting possessed and trying to attack the other one, taking the other one out, dismantling that family, that father-daughter bond that shows up. So this is a very recent phenomenon where we try to terrify people, get into the psyche. This really starts with the film Pscyho. And so this is one of the major ideas that out of Pscyho, we start looking at the human brain and not just a monster that we saw in the past, like early horror films from here. So we started off with horror films where we also can see that from what we talked about last time, the science horror genre blending a little bit with the idea of Frankenstein. We don't need to watch that again because we watched that for our science fiction. But no, we even have the Mummy as well, right? A real event, because it's the idea of trying to preserve something for all of eternity in death. This is going to lead us to many future Mummy movies as well.
Death, eternal punishment for anyone who opens this casket.
The mummy. Is it dead or alive? Human or inhuman? You'll know. You'll see. You'll feel the awful, creeping, crawling terror that stands your hair on end and brings a scream to your lips. There's nothing on earth like the mummy.
You will not remember what I show you now, and yet I shall awaken memories of love and crime and death.
Now I know his horrible plan. He's going to kill her and make her a living mummy like himself.
And of course, there's things with a million things, such as we can go the Invisible Man, the Thing, Swamp Creature. Many of these things have actually come back in the future as well. Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. So Lon Chaney is one of the masters of this early horror genre. So he's known as the man of 1,000 faces. Because look what Lon Chaney can do. When we talk about great actors, really that can manipulate their body movement and movement, Lon Chaney is that individual.
Yes, Lon Chaney was all of these. The Hunchback of Notre Dame, the Miracle Man, the Phantom of the Opera. The world, fascinated and thrilled, called him the Man of 1,000 Faces. But what was the secret Lon Chaney hid behind his 1,000 faces? What was the mystery in his life? Now, for the first time, the true story, torn from his heart, comes to the screen. Starring James Cagney, magnificent as the fabulous Lon Chaney, master of the grotesque, the weird, the strange, and Academy Award-winning Dorothy Malone and lovely Jane Greer as the two women who made his life more astounding, more touching than any of his unforgettable roles.
I'll come to see you every week, I promise you.
You should be fired. Damn.
So it's the idea of the man of 1,000 faces. No, just like we saw with the science fiction genre in the 1940s, the 1940s are really going to be making basically the same films that we made in the 1920s and the 1930s about such things as Frankenstein, Dracula. We do a little bit more comedy. Again, we want escapism because we're in the middle of World War II. We don't want to have those philosophical arguments. We want to have the idea of escapism, going out and doing something that's different from before. It's really in the 1950s and 1960s when horror will start taking off again in the United States. And that is largely, we have a younger generation, that generation from 15 to 40 or 15 to 35. Some people who are returning World War II veterans, but in starting their families. And so we have the baby boom generation. So we have a new kind of found way of thinking and celebrating freedom and the idea of what it means to be an American. But that also means then freedom to go out and explore different entities, which we just haven't done before. And so, you know, we're going to have a large group of population, particularly veterans coming back that are struggling mentally. And so that mental aspect of horror is going to start playing around with us. The Japanese, of course, developed the idea of Godzilla, Gojira, to understand their own predicament in the aftermath of the 50-foot woman, or 50-foot kind of radioactive. And of course, we have the doomsday films on the nuclear age. Ours is going to be the attack of the 50-foot woman, which we just started to watch. We were terrified of what does this nuclear attack now mean? Doomsday films. And like today, we have nature out of control wanting to kill us. You know, whether that's tornadoes or hurricanes or earthquakes or fire or 2012.
Once a normal, voluptuously beautiful woman, she drove into a nightmare of horror and saw descending from the sky a titanic monster whose fearsome touch became a frightful curse.
We're building upon King Kong with just the touch.
You think I'm drunk, don't you? All of you! I'm not drunk! I'm not! You've got to believe me. It was right in the middle of the highway, 30 feet tall. Once she's in the booby hatch, throw the key away. That'll put you in the driver's seat. You make a wild driver, Harry. For $50 million.
What she saw was beyond belief until others, too, faced its hideous, uncontrollable menace. Attack of the 50-foot woman, incredibly huge, with incredible desires for love and vengeance.
And so the 1960s then are going to bring us one of the most tumultuous periods in American history, where we're doing really well, we're the superpower, we have the Cold War going on, we're fighting in the Vietnam War, we have the civil rights movement, feminism, LGBTQ question mark, the sexual revolution, and the peace movement, all taking place in a matter of a decade. And so we're going to end up with many horror films that deal with various aspects. We're going to see some females that actually lose control. We're going to see some female heroines start to develop. We're going to start looking at the inner turmoil of the human mind as we see Norman Bates and look at those things. And one of the things that we're going to see mostly that's really going to shape later on is going to be the invention of the zombie tradition, the Night of the Living Dead. And so this was originally rated X because of the production codes of self-imposed censorship. That ended with McCarthyism in the end of the 1950s, early 1960s, and horror creativity is absolutely going to expand within this definition. So here is that actually preview, Night of the Living Dead, rated X, because you'll see a little bit of cannibalism that shows up.
Night of the living dead, the dead who live on living flesh, the dead whose haunted souls hunt the living whose bodies are the only food for these ungodly creatures.
And note one of the amazing things about this film as you watch it, the hero, who I don't know if they let on or not during this time period, the hero itself is actually an African American, built in 1968. And so as we're going through the civil rights movement, this is one of the things. Later on, when we remake Night of the Living Dead in the 1980s, after we've been to the feminist movement, the woman is actually going to be the heroine at the very end.
Of the living dead, a night with the dead.
All right, and then in the 1970s, we're going to continue on with that serial killer tradition very much within the process. And so we are actually going to invent new styles of horror film. Why? Because we live in an area where there's a lot less censorship. We've actually already been introduced to Pscyho and some of the idea of serial killers and some of the actions they do. So we're going to go for a whole horror, whole out gore. And so we're going to develop slasher films, the classical style of slasher films, from Friday the 13th, from the movie Halloween, and from The Nightmare on Elm Street. And really starting off with the classical one, 1978 of Halloween, which is still a fantastic film. It really does hold up in a modern day world.
The one, the only, the classic Halloween. Halloween night. A small American town. 15 years ago.
And note, you get the killer's perspective. One of the first times we actually ever see that.
Michael? Halloween.
I spent 8 years trying to reach him, and then another 7 trying to keep him locked up because I realized that what was living behind that boy's eyes was purely and simply evil. I think he'll come back.
Exploring uncharted territory. Totally charted. Just talk. Sure. The only reason Dave didn't have
Halloween. Come on out.
And note, this is a horror film that actually still holds up today. This is the idea of being stalked.
Halloween. The night he came home.
We're going to also develop the idea of different types of genres that show up, like The Exorcist. So we have the idea that are possessed by spirits in some aspects. So a classical version of that spirit possession. The Exorcist, one of the great horror movies of all time, generally ranked as the second or third best horror film of all time behind The Shining. Also developed during this classical age in the 70s, actually that one's in the 80s.
Somewhere between science and superstition, there is another world. The world of darkness. Nobody expected it.
All right, let's see what you do.
Nobody believed it. And nothing could stop it.
There are no experts. You probably know as much about possession as most priests. Look, your daughter doesn't say she's a demon. She says she's the devil himself.
I'm telling you that that thing upstairs isn't my daughter. Now, I want you to tell me that you know for a fact that there's nothing wrong with my daughter except in her mind. You tell me you know for a fact that an exorcism wouldn't do any good. You tell me that.
The one hope. The only hope. The Exorcist.
I'm going to tell you, if you are ever close to someone who goes through a psychotic break and you actually see the individual literally imagining things that aren't there and talking to voices, this film is quite disturbing in the aftermath of that, as I've personally gone through, to see just the kind of reality that people put into the world when it's not physically there. They believe it's there. And so that's what we're seeing within The Exorcist. Is it a psychotic break, or is it actually a demon that they're dealing with? We're also going to develop the idea of killer animal stories with Jaws by Spielberg. This is a classical film, and it's basically the invention of the summer blockbuster. Before this, I think we've mentioned this before in class, but before this, we used to have movies that we didn't think were going to do all that well, because summertime was the time when people are out and not going to the movies and not, going to movies for dates. And then Jaws came out, and it became summer season is let's go on dates, let's see the Avengers, let's go see major Hollywood wonderful films that are about power and love and aggression and friendship and good versus evil. This is the film that started that all. And we've seen a clip from this where I think we're going to need a bigger boat when we talked about kinetics, from shooting things high up and at a wider angle to slow the motion down even when the motion happens. We are also going to get to the idea in the 70s. There's a whole genre. So we have the initial stage of creating of a film, like what we call primitive stage. Then we have the classical style. Then we have revisionist and parody. And so parody actually makes fun of that genre. And that's what we see within the Rocky Horror Picture Show. So here is making fun, what we call
You've seen all kinds of movies.
comedy horror or parody.
You've never seen anything like
So here's a musical parody of Rocky Horror Picture Show. So it's semi-horror, and this became a cult classic, particularly amongst the LGBTQ community. And I will tell you, on every college campus around Hollywood, Halloween, there is generally a midnight showing of this. So at a four-year school, I would highly recommend going to see it. And it's one of the first films. It was a terrible, terrible film if you actually watch it. And yet it's totally fun and kitschy. So it did not do well commercially, but did fantastically well. It's one of the longest running movies because it's still running on college campuses around the country. And you have callbacks. So the audience actually yells things at the screen that the characters then answer back. So they're callbacks.
The songs are super. The scenery is smashing. The cast is completely crazy. This isn't the Junior Chamber of Commerce class. There's a mad scientist named Frank N. Furter.
Come up to the lab and see what's on the slab.
And Rocky, his incredible creature.
He was in with a bad crowd, but it was worse than I imagined.
A sinister servant named Riffraff.
Doing the time war!
And Brad and Janet.
My name's Brad Major.
Just a couple of clean-cut kids.
This is my fiance, Janet White.
Eddie.
That is actually the rock and roll star beat note.
Magenta. Columbia. Dr. Scott. So give yourself over to absolute pleasure. See the Rocky Horror Picture Show.
So this is what we call the idea of parody. It's the next generation that happens. And once we get to the classical stage, we can start revising the classical stage. We also can start parodying like we do there. Scary Movie is another one later on that is actually going to parody the genre that shows up. During the 1980s, this kind of idea of great capitalism with the United States. We're going to start literally saving people through first artificial hearts. We're going to have Titanic wreckage discovered, World AIDS Day. So we're going to start looking at diseases and outbreak and other kind of horror films that show up. And we're going to continue on that genre of the serial killer in different capacities. And the psychological kind of issues that started with Psycho, we're going to continue as well. Plus, we're going to start off with different special effects. So here we're going to look into the mind of a man that's actually going insane and terrorizing his family. Probably the most important thing that happens. I generally consider the best horror film of all time, followed generally by The Exorcist.
He came up here with his wife and two little girls, I think about 8.
So this is really the hallmark of classical for psychological horror. A father haunting his family in an isolated area where they can't get away.
Complete mental breakdown. He ran amok and killed his family with an axe.
You can rest assured, Mr. Ullman, that's not going to happen with me.
Mom? Yeah? You're really going to live in that other half of the country? Sure. It'll be lots of fun. Yeah, I guess so.
For some people, solitude, isolation can of itself become a problem.
What you do? It kills you with that.
Here's Johnny.
This is Kubrick's horror film. So everything you see is exactly how Kubrick wanted. And the actress, Shelley Duvall, literally doesn't act for the next 4 years because she is so terrified by the way she's treated, having to act over and over these scenes of psychological horror to where she really was at her mental breaking point. We're also going to develop new styles of special effects. So we can do things like we've never been able to do before. So horror becomes more real. And once it becomes more real, it becomes more terrifying because we can put it in your face. No longer is it just looking at two individuals. You're actually seeing what happens.
What is it?
Do you think it's a dog? Nice doggy. Good boy.
What happened to them?
Well, the police report said they were attacked by an escaped lunatic. A wolf. My friend Jack was just here. Told me that I will become a monster in 2 days.
Your dead friend, Jack.
Yes.
Gotta believe me, David.
Believe what? You're one of the undead, and I'm a werewolf.
Oh, nice and full moon. You're gonna change. You'll become.
I know.
And so the actual transformation that took place takes about a minute. It's considered one of the best special effects. Because we literally do change the jawbone and everything else.
What did I do last night?
You don't remember?
The last remaining werewolf must be destroyed. It's you, David.
So this does become a cult masterpiece because of the transitioning later. Of course, we're going to see individuals such as Michael Jackson play off on it in his Thriller video. Other classical versions in terms of the idea that show up during this time period, if you haven't already seen this one, is actually Poltergeist, which deals with the idea of the classical setup production of kind of a child that gets
The house
possessed.
looks just like the one next to it. And the one next to that. And the one next to that. A young couple live in it. Give Ken a kiss.
You're so nuts!
With their 3 children. And something more.
Sweetie, this is last night. You remember when you woke up and you said you were here? Well, who did you meet? Who's here?
Something's funny going on here next door. Something,
We were wondering if maybe you had experienced any disturbances.
What kind of disturbances?
I don't know what happens over his house.
That thing is in there with my baby.
For high reason. Now Steven Spielberg crosses a frightening new threshold into a world within our own. Its form is revealed. What is it? Its focus is clear. And the games are over. Poltergeist. It knows what scares you.
Think about how different this is than the family normal affair that we have with Jurassic Park from Steven Spielberg, or the idea of E.T. Really does challenge just the notion on what kind of a wonderful range, what an amazing director he is. So that Halloween, that 80s is going to be the age of sequels and slasher films, largely that came out from the 70s, but it's going to deal with the same genre. But no, we're just building up upon the genre. We haven't not lost anything that shows up. So we have new ones that are showing up to actually help build it. And this is redone from an earlier horror film from the from the classic age of Hollywood from 1930. So here's the classic version of The Thing.
Men had just discovered something. For 100,000 years, it was buried in the snow and ice. Now it has found a place to live. Inside. Where no one can see it, or hear it, or feel it.
I know I'm human. Some of you are still human. This thing doesn't want to show itself. It wants to hide inside an imitation. It'll fight if it has to, but it's vulnerable out in the open.
It's very similar to the invasions of the body snatchers. We're exploring the world, and as we do, we're wondering what happens. You know, is the polar caps melt? Are there these things that could kill us there that have been buried underneath the ice and the soil for thousands of years? We want to often think that we are the top predator, but are we actually the top predator, or just the top predator living right now? And those are the questions and the ideas that the Thing is asking about. Particularly when we look at things that happen in the polar cap, or man is the warmest place to hide. Another great tagline. So in the 1990s, then, we are going to continue on that idea, but we're going to get much more psychological realism, particularly this, when we look at the only horror film that's ever won the Academy Award, because the acting by Sir Anthony Hopkins as he plays Hannibal Lecter is spectacular. And based upon a true character, just like Pscyho was, which kind of terrifies us as much. We're also going to get this idea more playful side for teenagers, where we have your child toys come to life and basically take you out, whether that is Chucky or Bride of Chucky. And we're going to have Japanese horror. We're going to start looking at other cultures and their horror elements to bring in new things that show up. So we're going to have the revisionist aspect that starts to show up. So this is right on the verge of classical and revisionist. The acting is so good, it's actually making it so realistic that we're revising the genre a little bit, which had been a little bit cartoonish in earlier sections, right? The slasher films
keeps them alive for 3 days. Then he shoots them, spins them, and dumps them.
A rookie FBI agent is on his trail.
He's got real physical strength, cautious, precise. He's never impulsive. He'll never stop.
But in order to track him down, she'll have to match wits.
I'll help you catch him, Barry.
Believe me, you don't want Hannibal Lecter inside your head. With the darkest of all minds. Just do your job and never forget what he is.
But he's a monster. Pure psychopath. So rare to capture one alive.
So close to the way you're going to catch him. Do you realize that?
The terrifying thing is that we estimate there's 2 to 3 serial killers running around in about every state in America.
All this easy stuff.
Now, the population of 320 million, that's still a tiny fraction that they are out there. And that's part of the Silence of the Lambs fear that shows up. He basically changes the way acting in a horror film looks. This type of acting really will even play off in terms of the Joker with Heath Ledger later on, or Joaquin Phoenix, as he just won the Academy Award for the Joker this year. Now, as we're looking at these revisionist aspects, note the revisionism of Scream. It takes everything that shows up from what we know about older horror films.
Hello?
Hello.
Who is this?
And it's going to play with those earlier tropes.
I don't think so.
What's that noise?
Popcorn.
You're making popcorn?
I'm getting ready to watch a video.
Really? What?
Oh, just some scary movie.
You like scary movies? You never told me your name.
Why do you want to know my name?
I want to know who I'm looking at.
He's playing a deadly game.
It all began with a scream over 911.
Someone who's seen one too many scary movies. Now he's taking his love of fear
Hello?
Hello, Sydney.
one step too far.
Like scary movies.
What's the point? They're all the same. Some stupid killer stalking some big-breasted girl who can't act. She's always running up the stairs and she should be going out the front door. It's insulting.
There are certain rules that one must abide by in order to successfully survive a scary movie. Number 1, you can never have sex. Never, ever, under any circumstances, say, I'll be right back. Because you won't be back. Get another beer, you want one? Yeah, sure. I'll be right back.
He didn't make the rules.
So this is rewriting the rules, of course, of the horror genre that we've seen to date, particularly the slasher movies.
Try to hide.
It was a very good movie in and of itself. And so here's the revisionist horror that shows up. Another revisionist horror, I won't go through all of them, but it's the Blair Witch Project, right? Running into the woods or going to find horror as teenagers and then disappearing, loosely based upon a real story. And then finally parody, where we take Scream and we make fun of the entire genre, not just Scream, but everything earlier in a movie called Scary Movie. No, you'll see the references right away.
Have a little fun.
Who's this?
Tell me your name and I'll tell you mine.
I don't think so.
You like scary movies?
Mm-hmm.
What's that noise?
I farted. I didn't think you would hear me.
Oh, stinky.
From the people who had nothing to do with Scream.
Decker got killed last night. She sits next to me in English class. Was she a friend? No. I was going to cheat off her test today.
They didn't make the rules. They're just too stupid to follow them.
We have to call the police.
No way. I ain't going to jail. Okay, I'm fine. Well, get rid of the body.
This summer.
There are certain rules to follow in order to survive a horror movie. Rule number 1.
Don't answer the phone.
I'm in the house. You know where I am.
You're behind behind the couch. I can see your feet.
What? Oh, don't run in the woods. Don't talk to reporters.
The press only wants to interview the most ignorant person they can find.
I want TV. Apology. First cop down it. And whatever you do. Don't be afraid to rise to the occasion. Oh! Dimension Films presents.
I just want you to look at some photos. Tell me what you think. No? What the shit? Oh, man.
Scary movie.
Can I tell you a secret?
Dead people?
This is awesome.
And in the 2000s, where we currently are, we get a number of kind of new influxes, particularly about spiritual idea. Japan believes in the concept from their traditional religion called Shinto of kami, way of the spirits that show up. And so they have a natural tendency towards ghosts and other spirits that are very territorial and need to be honored. And if they're not honored, can wreak some real havoc. So we see in some of the remakes that show up from Japanese films.
I'm not gonna get all worked up over some rumor. Yeah, show it to me.
And this was a wonderful horror film that's deal with kind of suspense and surprise and multiple characters trying to piece the mystery together before you figure it out, just like we would what the first video actually talked about. The rise of the 2000s also gave rise to torture porn. The idea of ameliorating and destroying the human body for no other reason than for pleasure, very much to the similar ideas of what Stephen King said about horror, that he wants to see the most aggressive of them. And this is on some level to purge our monsters so we don't want to do it, at least according to Stephen King. So we get things such as Saw.
Live or die. Make your choice.
So we get this idea, and that actually offends many people, the idea of this very torturous aspect that shows up. So we've got all these different creatures now, all these different monsters. Some actually play with you and make you do it yourself. Some are actually the victims, or former victims that come back to life to haunt you. Others are monsters that actually chase you down. And so the whole notion is, as we look at these horror films, we've got all sorts of genres. And as society progresses and we learn more and become fearful of more things, we have a more range of horror films because we're afraid of way more things, even though we're way safer today than we've ever been in human history. So we go from the very primitive early film monsters of the 1930s and the 40s. So we go to the classical establishment. So we go to the revisionist and then the parody, which are not nearly as scary, but really play on those comedic fears that show up. And that's what we're looking at. Any questions? No? We'll have a wonderful day. And I will stop our share then. Goodbye.